I think it's probably too soon to tell and too soon to say, but obviously pretty gutted about the decision. We thought it was going to go our way.
Royal fortunes and family legacies rarely unravel in public. Yet explosive reports now claim Prince Harry may have lost access to his entire inheritance, reigniting whispers of a chilling warning once linked to Princess Diana. Insiders, commentators, and royal watchers are scrambling to separate truth from speculation as Meghan's influence is thrust into the center of the storm. Supporters defend, critics intensify, and the story spreads across global headlines overnight. So, is this the dramatic fulfillment of a long-discussed prophecy, or another controversial chapter clouded by rumor and interpretation? When the safety net finally gave way. The realization did not arrive with a court ruling, a dramatic announcement, or a single irreversible decision. It came quietly, settling in among those closest to the situation with a sense of cold finality. Prince Harry's inheritance from Princess Diana, the legacy meant to shield him for life, was no longer serving its purpose, not because it had been formally seized or publicly revoked, but because, in practice, it had stopped protecting him at all. What once stood as a carefully designed safety net had unraveled strand by strand, leaving Harry exposed in ways his mother had feared more than any financial loss. From the beginning, Diana's inheritance for her sons was never just about money. It was structured around stability, privacy, and long-term security. The wealth she left behind was meant to exist quietly in the background, untouched by public conflict, shielded from unnecessary scrutiny, and safeguarded by discretion. It was a form of protection that worked only if Harry's life remained anchored to restraint and structure. For years, that balance held. The inheritance functioned as intended, present, dependable, and largely invisible. That balance began to shift the moment Harry stepped away from the world his mother had designed the inheritance to operate within. His post-royal life introduced instability, where consistency had once been essential. Decisions that favored exposure over privacy, confrontation over quiet negotiation, and immediacy over patience began to erode the conditions that allowed the inheritance to remain effective. Each public interview, each deeply personal disclosure, and each commercial venture tied to his identity chipped away at the protective framework Diana had built so carefully. Insiders describe a slow, unsettling realization taking hold. There was no single breaking point, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was a growing awareness that Harry no longer had true access, not just to the funds themselves, but to the protection, leverage, and security they were meant to provide. Control slipped away as his life became increasingly public. Protection weakened as conflict replaced discretion. What had once secured his future now sat powerless against the realities of his present. The most difficult truth to confront was that nothing had been forcibly taken from him. No door was slammed shut overnight. The inheritance did not vanish in a moment of punishment or judgment. It slipped away gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the conditions required to sustain it were dismantled by choice after choice. Each step felt manageable at the time, even justified, but together they formed a path that led Harry far beyond the reach of the legacy meant to guard him. For those who understood Diana's intentions, the situation felt tragically familiar. She had known that wealth alone could never protect a vulnerable heart. She understood that inheritance only works when paired with caution, structure, and a life that allows it to function as a shield rather than a spotlight. As those foundations fell away, so too did the inheritance's ability to serve its purpose. By the time the full weight of the situation became clear, the damage was already done. The realization was stark and unsettling. Harry was living beyond the reach of the protection his mother had left him, not because it was gone, but because the life he now led no longer allowed it to hold. But how did Diana's carefully designed protection fail, leaving Harry exposed when the inheritance still existed, but no longer worked? Stay with us. The turning point that rewrote everything. What followed the slow unraveling of Prince Harry's protection was not accidental, Nor was it driven by chance. It came through influence, steady, persuasive, and deeply personal. Meghan Markle did not enter Harry's life as a villain or a schemer, but her worldview stood in sharp contrast to the system Princess Diana had quietly designed around her son. Where Diana valued restraint, privacy, and long-term insulation from public pressure, Meghan believed in visibility, independence, and taking control of one's own narrative. That difference, subtle at first, would ultimately redirect the course of Harry's legacy. Meghan's approach to power was rooted in expression rather than containment. She encouraged Harry to speak openly, to confront perceived wrongs directly, and to reclaim his story from institutions that had long managed it for him. On the surface, these choices appeared empowering. They promised freedom, self-definition, and emotional honesty. But beneath that promise lay a fundamental conflict with the way Harry's inheritance was meant to function. Diana's legacy was never designed to survive constant exposure. It relied on quiet continuity, legal stability, and a distance from public battles that could compromise its integrity. As Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal life, the shift became unmistakable. Separation from the institution also meant separation from the protective structures that had long surrounded Harry, structures that buffered his finances, reputation, and personal security. Meghan supported decisions that brought those conflicts into the open: televised interviews, detailed personal revelations, and commercial projects that placed Harry's identity at the center of public debate. Each move generated attention and income in the short term, but they also dismantled the environment his inheritance depended on to remain effective. The monetization of royal identity marked a critical turning point. By turning deeply personal experiences into public currency, Harry crossed an invisible line. What had once been a private legacy became entangled with contracts, platforms, and public opinion. The inheritance Diana left him was never meant to operate under those conditions. It was structured to protect a son who lived quietly, not to support a life shaped by confrontation and constant exposure. As that line blurred, the protections surrounding Harry weakened. The loss was not immediate, and it was not announced. Instead, the inheritance became increasingly impractical. Access grew complicated. Control diminished. What remained was wealth without insulation, resources without the framework that allowed them to function as a shield. Inheritance, in its truest form, is not just money. It is trust, stability, and the ability to rely on structures that endure beyond headlines. Those structures cannot survive when placed under relentless public strain. Meghan's influence did not erase Harry's inheritance outright. Rather, it reshaped his life so completely that the inheritance could no longer serve its intended purpose. By encouraging independence through exposure, confrontation, and public storytelling, she helped move Harry into a world where Diana's quiet safeguards could not follow. The tragedy lies not in malice, but in mismatch. Two visions of power collided, one built on silence and protection, the other on voice and visibility. And in that collision, Harry's legacy was left stranded, present in name but unusable in reality, setting the stage for consequences that were only just beginning to unfold. So, what happens when Diana's silent protections collide with visibility, leaving Harry rich on paper yet powerless in reality? Alone, stay glued. The fear Diana never spoke about, in public. As the consequences of Prince Harry's choices began to surface, one truth grew harder to ignore. Princess Diana's deepest fear had never been the palace itself. It was not the rigid protocols, the weight of titles, or the cold machinery of monarchy that troubled her most. Those were familiar forces, predictable and visible. What unsettled her was far more intimate and far less controllable. Harry's emotional openness, his longing for connection, and his tendency to trust with his whole heart. Diana understood power and conflict. She had faced institutional pressure, public scrutiny, and private pain long before her sons were grown. But when she looked at Harry, She did not see a future prince at risk of being defeated by systems or rules. She saw a boy who felt deeply, who craved affection, and who believed in people even when caution would have been wiser. That, in her mind, was the true vulnerability. She worried not that Harry would be pushed aside by authority, but that he would willingly step away from protection if it meant preserving love. Those close to Diana recalled how often she described Harry as open, warm, and instinctively trusting. She admired those qualities, yet they frightened her. She knew charm could soften defenses, and reassurance could quiet doubts that deserved to be examined more closely. In Diana's experience, the most dangerous moments were not marked by hostility or force, but by comfort, the feeling of being understood, supported, and encouraged to let one's guard down. She feared Harry might mistake emotional closeness for safety, and in doing so, overlook the consequences of decisions made too quickly or too publicly. Her concern was never about betrayal by the monarchy. She did not believe the institution would deliberately strip Harry of his future. Instead, she feared something subtler, that Harry might be guided gently and lovingly into choices that slowly dismantled the protections surrounding him. She understood how love could reshape priorities, how the desire to belong could outweigh the instinct to preserve one's own security. Diana had lived long enough to know that emotional influence can be far more powerful than authority, because it does not feel like pressure at all. Diana's private reflections reveal a mother who anticipated a crossroads long before it appeared. She believed Harry would one day face a choice between caution and connection, between preserving the quiet safeguards built for him and embracing a life driven by emotional truth and openness. Her fear was not rooted in suspicion of any individual, but in the pattern she recognized within her son. Harry, she knew, would always choose the human bond first. And in a world where legacy depends on discretion and restraint, that choice could carry a heavy cost. As Harry's life unfolded, the echoes of Diana's concern grew louder. The decisions he made in pursuit of love and understanding began to mirror the very future she had worried about. Not a dramatic fall caused by enemies or institutions, but a gradual exposure brought on by trust, closeness, and the belief that emotional honesty would be enough to protect him. Diana had foreseen that danger not because she distrusted love, but because she knew how powerful it could be, and how easily it could lead her youngest son to surrender the very protections meant to keep him safe without ever realizing what he was giving up. And now the chilling question lingers. Did Diana foresee love undoing Harry's armor long before the world ever noticed everything? Stay tuned. The warnings that were never meant for the world. Long before the consequences became visible, Princess Diana had been leaving traces of concern behind her, quiet markers of a future she sensed but could not stop. They were not dramatic predictions or public declarations. Instead, they lived in letters written in private moments, in conversations held behind closed doors, and in patterns of worry she returned to again and again when speaking about her youngest son. At the time, they sounded like the natural anxieties of a protective mother. Only now do they read like something more deliberate, more urgent. Diana never spoke of fate in grand terms, yet she often hinted at a future where Harry might find himself isolated, cut off not only from family support, but from the very security meant to follow him through life. In her private writings, she returned to the idea of protection, how easily it could be lost if treated as entitlement rather than responsibility. She believed inheritance was not a reward or a tool for freedom without limits. To her, it was a shield, designed to work only if handled with care. Without restraint, she feared it could turn from safety net to silent risk. In conversations with trusted confidants, Diana repeatedly voiced concern about publicity. She had lived through the cost of constant exposure and understood how it could distort judgment and strain even the strongest foundations. She worried that Harry, with his open heart and desire to be understood, might one day confuse attention with support. Outsiders, she believed, were not inherently dangerous, but blurred boundaries were. When private life becomes public property, protection weakens, and decisions once guided by caution begin to shift toward immediacy and emotion. At the heart of Diana's concern was a simple belief: Harry's inheritance was meant to steady him, not embolden reckless choices. She feared a future where access to resources might encourage risk rather than restraint, where emotional reassurance could drown out quiet warnings. Her letters suggest she understood how easily good intentions could pave the way to irreversible outcomes. She did not fear sudden disaster. She feared gradual drift, the slow erosion of safeguards through repeated compromises. Yet at the time, few truly listened. Diana's words were often softened by those who heard them, framed as the understandable worries of a mother shaped by trauma and public pressure. Some believed she was projecting her own experiences onto Harry's future. Others assumed that systems, advisors, and tradition would always be there to intervene if needed. Her concerns were acknowledged, then gently set aside, overshadowed by the belief that Harry would always be protected simply because of who he was. What no one fully grasped was that Diana's warnings were not emotional guesses. They were patterns, observed carefully over time, drawn from her intimate understanding of her son and the world he inhabited. She had seen how easily affection could become influence, how reassurance could replace caution, and how quickly protection could dissolve once boundaries blurred. Her foresight lay not in predicting specific events, but in recognizing how character and circumstance might one day collide. As Harry's life unfolded, those quiet warnings began to echo with uncomfortable clarity. The isolation Diana feared was no longer theoretical. The exposure she warned against had become routine. The inheritance she hoped would shield him now struggled to function in the life he was living. What was once dismissed as maternal anxiety now appeared as something closer to preparation, a mother recording her fears not to alarm the world, but in the hope that one day, when the signs were impossible to ignore, her concerns would finally be understood for what they were. As Diana's warnings resurface amid Harry's unraveling, was this prophecy ignored, or was protection deliberately withdrawn when it mattered most? Keep watching. The moment protection gave way to devotion. What Diana feared most began to take shape not through conflict, but through closeness. Love became the turning point. As Prince Harry's world narrowed, Meghan increasingly became his primary source of guidance, his confidant, strategist, and lens through which decisions were made. This was not a hostile takeover of influence. It was a gradual shift born of trust. The more Harry relied on that bond, the more other voices faded. Advisors who once urged caution were sidelined. Family perspectives felt distant. Traditions that had quietly stabilized his life began to seem restrictive rather than protective. Isolation did not arrive as loneliness. It arrived as certainty. With fewer counterweights around him, Harry's choices grew bolder and more public. Decisions that once would have been filtered through layers of discretion were now driven by immediacy and conviction. The effect was subtle but decisive. Inheritance, especially the kind designed by Diana, requires a calm environment to function. It depends on restraint, predictability, and the absence of open warfare. Once public confrontation became routine, those conditions evaporated. Public disputes do not just strain relationships, they destabilize structures. Trust funds and legacy protections are built to endure quietly, not to be tested under constant scrutiny. As Harry's life filled with interviews, statements, and commercial ventures tied to personal grievances, the ground beneath his inheritance shifted. Stability, its essential foundation, began to crack. The protections did not fail dramatically. They thinned. Access became complicated. Safeguards weakened. What had once been a shield now struggled to keep pace with the life unfolding around it. This was not about greed or ambition. It was about devotion overriding distance. Love encouraged openness. Openness invited exposure. Exposure undermined discretion. With each step, the inheritance designed to protect Harry became less able to do so. Diana's legacy was not built to survive constant conflict. It was built to shelter a son who moved carefully through a dangerous world. As that care gave way to closeness and caution yielded to conviction, the mechanism of loss revealed itself, not as betrayal, but as the quiet cost of choosing connection over containment. Now, could love itself be the hidden force that dismantled Diana's safeguards, leaving Harry exposed and locked outside his inheritance? Locked outside the legacy meant to save him. The truth, once stripped of emotion and rumor, was far colder than any headline suggested. Prince Harry did not wake up one morning to find his inheritance suddenly gone. There was no single moment when money vanished or accounts were emptied. What happened was more unsettling than loss itself. He lost access, he lost control, and most critically, he lost the leverage that made Princess Diana's legacy capable of protecting him in the first place. Inheritance of this kind was never meant to operate in turbulence. Diana's provisions for Harry were designed for continuity, not conflict. They depended on a life lived with restraint, predictability, and a clear separation between private security and public identity. As Harry's world became increasingly loud and confrontational, that structure began to fail. Legacy wealth cannot function properly when its owner is locked in ongoing public battles. Under those conditions, protection turns into exposure, and security becomes risk. Harry's public positioning played a decisive role. By tying his identity to open grievances, televised revelations, and commercial storytelling, he shifted how his inheritance was perceived and how it could be used. Wealth meant to sit quietly in the background now stood uncomfortably close to controversy. What once provided insulation now attracted scrutiny. The inheritance did not disappear, but it could no longer move freely without consequence. Every action Harry took amplified the limitations placed around what had once been a safety net. Legacy wealth relies on one core principle: restraint. It is sustained by patience, silence, and the absence of spectacle. Once those conditions vanish, inheritance stops functioning as protection and starts behaving like a liability. Harry's public conflicts introduced instability into a system that required calm. Advisors and institutions that once ensured smooth access became cautious. Safeguards tightened. Processes slowed, not out of punishment, but out of necessity. When chaos enters the picture, legacy systems retreat. This shift marked the moment Harry was effectively locked out, not barred, not banished, but restricted by the realities of his own visibility. The more his life unfolded in public, the less room there was for quiet security to operate. Diana's safety net had limits. It was designed to catch a son navigating danger with care, not one standing in the center of it. Once Harry placed himself in the spotlight, the net could no longer stretch far enough to reach him. What made this outcome unavoidable was its logic. Inheritance cannot shield someone who lives in permanent confrontation. It cannot protect a future when every step is contested in public view. Over time, the mechanisms that once guaranteed stability became hesitant, constrained by reputational risk and structural caution. Harry did not lose money overnight. He lost the environment that allowed his inheritance to work. Diana understood this long before anyone else. She knew protection required distance from conflict. She knew legacy wealth was fragile when exposed to constant strain. Her safety net was never infinite. It relied on choices that kept its threads intact. As Harry's choices pulled him further from that framework, the net held its shape, but it could no longer catch him. What remains is not a dramatic fall, but a quiet lockout. The inheritance still exists, yet its purpose has been compromised. Access has narrowed, control has weakened, leverage has faded. The story is not one of theft or punishment, but of inevitability. When restraint gives way to chaos, even the most carefully built legacy can only watch as the person it was meant to protect steps beyond its reach. How did Harry's choices quietly unravel a legacy meant to protect him, leaving wealth intact but safety slipping through his hands? The future, Diana tried to warn him about. By the time the full picture comes into focus, the resemblance is unsettling. Prince Harry is now living the very future Princess Diana once feared for him, not in fragments, but almost entirely. It is a life shaped by distance rather than belonging, by exposure rather than protection, and by constant motion rather than stability. The separation is no longer symbolic. It is practical, emotional, and deeply consequential. Harry stands apart from the family structure that once surrounded him, removed from the quiet systems designed to steady him when the world became overwhelming. Diana had always understood that legacy was more than inheritance. Family, protection, and financial security were meant to work together, reinforcing one another. When one element weakened, the others became vulnerable. Today, Harry exists largely outside that ecosystem. The familiar anchors of family guidance and institutional shielding have fallen away, leaving him to navigate a far less forgiving environment. What remains is visibility without insulation, freedom without the safety net that once followed him everywhere. The shift is evident in how Harry now sustains his life. Where once his future was secured quietly, it is now tied to deals, projects, and continued relevance. Visibility has become currency. Exposure has become a necessity. Each appearance, partnership, or public statement carries weight not just as expression, but as survival. The irony is sharp. The inheritance meant to free him from such pressures can no longer reach him precisely because of the life that depends on them. Protection requires distance from constant scrutiny, and Harry's world no longer allows that distance to exist. This is where Diana's foresight feels most haunting. She did not fear that Harry would be punished or rejected. She feared he would drift, slowly, lovingly, into a life where protection could not follow. Her concern was never about rules or authority. It was about consequence. She understood that choices made in the name of love could still carry irreversible costs, even when intentions were pure. She believed that emotional fulfillment and long-term security did not always move in the same direction. The inheritance she left behind was meant to shield Harry from exactly this kind of dependence. It was designed to sit quietly behind the scenes, ensuring he would never have to trade privacy for survival or turn personal history into public currency. Yet that shield now sits just out of reach, not because it was taken away, but because the path Harry chose led him beyond its limits. The distance between him and that protection was created gradually, through decisions that prioritized connection, honesty, and visibility over restraint. Diana's prophecy, if it can be called that, was never mystical. It was observational. She saw her son clearly. She knew his heart. She understood how easily love could become the lens through which every other choice was made. She feared that Harry would one day choose devotion over discretion, and that the cost would not be immediate, but cumulative. What is unfolding now feels less like fate and more like the natural result of that pattern. The tragedy lies in its subtlety. No villain is standing at the end of this story, no single act that sealed the outcome. Instead, there is a consequence unfolding exactly as Diana imagined it might. Harry chose love, and in doing so, stepped away from a legacy built to protect him quietly. He gained a life defined by voice and visibility, but lost the shelter that allowed inheritance to function as safety rather than spectacle. And yet, the story does not offer easy judgment. It leaves behind a question that lingers uncomfortably, one Diana herself might have asked if she were still here. What is the true measure of a life well lived? Security or connection? Protection or authenticity? Harry's journey forces that question into the open, as the inheritance meant to shield him fades further into the background, and his future becomes increasingly tied to exposure and public engagement. The cost of that choice grows clearer. Whether that cost was worth paying remains unanswered, hanging in the space between love gained and legacy lost, waiting for each viewer to decide where they stand. So, what do you think? Did Harry knowingly trade lifelong protection for love? Or did Diana see this ending long before anyone else did? We'd love your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.